Today we want to look at one of the saddest stories in the Old Testament. Hezekiah was one of the few Old Testament kings who did right in the eyes of God. Yet, as good as he was and as godly as he was, he failed miserably in the area of succession planning and leadership transition. His son, his successor, Manasseh, was one of the most wicked kings in Israel's history. So how did a good king, a godly king, a man who was righteous, reproduce a bad son who became an evil king? The answer to that question is complicated, but the part that pertains to succession planning is obvious when we read 2 Kings chapter 20. Here's the story. Toward the end of Hezekiah's reign, the king of Babylon sent envoys to visit Hezekiah, who foolishly allowed them to spy on his palace, his royal treasures, armory, his storehouses. Part of it was Hezekiah's pride at showing all of his accomplishments, trying to impress somebody. The prophet Isaiah stepped on the scene and immediately issued a strong rebuke that included a warning of Babylonian attack that would result in everything they owned being stolen, ransacked, taken to Babylon. Worse than losing their homes and their buildings and their possessions, Isaiah also prophesied that their sons and daughters would be taken as prisoners to Babylon. Now, Hezekiah's response to this prophetic warning explains why he failed to prepare his successor. It was his whole mentality that was wrong. 2 Kings 20 verse 19 says, "Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, 'The word of the Lord that you have spoken is good.' For he thought, 'Why not, if there will be peace and security in my days?'" Now, this is amazing for a godly, good man to think this way. How can anybody think that poverty and captivity for the next generation is a good thing? Hezekiah only thought about his leadership position, his generation. He only thought about right now. If he experienced peace and prosperity, then in his mind, all was well. Let the next generation deal with the problems that I leave behind. It's not my problem because we have peace right now. Obviously, that's a horrible attitude for a father, for a king, for a leader, for a pastor, for anyone else not to think multi-generationally and not to think long-term. Hezekiah's mentality is the exact opposite of the multi-generational leadership succession mentality presented throughout the book of Genesis. The phrase, "To your offspring, I will give this land." To your offspring, not just to you, but your offspring, I'll give this land. That phrase was repeated by God to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Joseph. It appears in Genesis 12, 13, 15, 17, multiple times. Though he was a good leader for most of his life, Hezekiah failed the next generation because he didn't share God's multi-generational leadership vision. Though Hezekiah was good and godly as a leader for most of his life, he failed in one of the greatest leadership tasks that any leader ever has because he failed to create and execute a succession plan. If we want to solve our leadership shortages, then we have to at some point look at succession planning that leads to healthy leadership transition.